In the chiasmatic hourglass of the first segment of a series called Sequence for Mumia Abu-Jamal, one traces a curve called arc from the word silenced to the word silenced, from the phrase must be silenced to the phrase must not be silenced, from the line some voices must be silenced to the line some voices must not be silenced. In the curve described by that arc, one finds the words silenced, the, seemingly, there. No, those aren't the words one finds there, are they? Those are the words one begins to trace and stops. Those are the words one catches themselves on and erases, being silenced by the need to draw the curve as it would occur, created by a mathematician or someone more talented, someone gifted with an understanding of such curves. Let's trace the curve again. The curve called arc formed in the two stanzas described perhaps as segment 1 in a series defined as Sequence for Mumia Abu-Jamal. Begin and end with the word silenced. The point of the curve, described as an arc, passes through two words at its apex or near its apex. In fact, the apex is silence and represents the space designating the separation between the two stanzas. The lines approximate to that space near the apex of the arc are informed by the words shielding and but, perhaps. Perhaps that arc passes through the words the, clear, may, or shatter. Perhaps that arc passes through the words smoke, here, against, and here again. If the arc formed by the curve in the chiasmatic hourglass of the first segment of a poem defined as Sequence for Mumia Abu-Jamal were to be drawn inversely from a point beginning not on the right side of the stanza, but at its inception on the left, The arc can begin with the word some. The arc can be said to begin with some. The arc can be said to end with the word some. The arc can be said to end with some. From some to some. From some voices to some voices. From some voices must to some voices must. From the inception, some voices must be, to the conclusion, some voices must not be. From the inception, some voices must be silenced, to the conclusion, some voices must not be silenced. If beginning as a figure of chiasmus defined by a curve and informed by the structure and metaphor of the hourglass, Mumia waits on death row, waits by the figure determined chiasmatically in the form of an hourglass, sand slipping through time as a measure of time and marker of time. An hourglass incompleted within the hour, an hourglass incompleted within the space of a day, an hourglass incompleted within a week, a month, a year, a decade. An endless flow of sand defined as death row, awaiting in a stasis of death, silenced, because some voices begin the arc on one side of the hourglass and silenced ends the arc on the other, because some silenced and silenced some, because silenced some and some silenced, because silenced must be some voices, because some voices must not be silenced. Because sand flows and some voices, because silence in the flowing sand, because the endless flow of sand within the silenced voices, because the voices have been replaced by the flow of sand, because a voice is a story, because a voice is a narrative. If the voice were not a story, would the sand still flow? Would the sand flow downward? Would the structure of time exceed the physics of gravity defined by the flowing of sand from the arc that narrows at its center in the space of an absence of line, a space separating stanza the first from stanza the second, from stanza the beginning to stanza the end. In that narrow space which defines the flowing of sand, there are no lines. But the line begins where the arc opens upward and the arc opens again downward. And in that space, in the center of the hourglass formed by the two segments of the two stanzas of the first segment of a poem defined as sequence for Mumia Abu-Jamal, one finds the words from and choose. Choose from. Choose from life or this. Choose from silenced must be or silenced must not be. Choose from some voices or some voices. Choose from story or narrative. Choose from narrative or non-narrative. Is the non-narrative silence equivalent to the silenced story? Would the story be silenced if it were not narrative? Would the narrative be more relevant if the story were found elsewhere? If the story of the silencing does not lie in the silence, where does it lie? Does it lie in the threat of the structures of violence? Does it lie in what is seen and unseen? Does it lie in the seemingly and the safe? Does it lie in the respectable lives that exist elsewhere, outside the hourglass of time through which sand represents the marking of hours, days, weeks, months, years, decades of waiting on death row, in which the only waiting for is the final stanza of one's life, to be silenced again as one has been silenced in the waiting. Are the structures apparent in the hourglass? Are the structures apparent in the poem? Are the structures apparent in the sequence? Are the structures of power and violence apparent in the name Mumia Abu-Jamal? Are the structures and powers of silencing made familiar in the silences and the spaces that exist between the stanzas in the poem, between the separations, between the segments of the sequence, between the spaces of the words in the poem, between some and voices, between voices and must, between must and be, between be and silenced? Are the silences between such words available to be read as instances of the structures of power? Are they available to those who live safe, respectable lives? Are their vibrations clear? Do silences even vibrate at all? Is the sand that flows through the hourglass of waiting on death row in fact silent? Or only silent to those who cannot hear the clear vibrations of time? The crystalline shelters of those who live respectable lives, will they shatter at the hearing of such vibrations of time? Are they silent, muffled, muted, in order to protect the crystalline shelters that the poet says encase us from reality, from the reality of the vibrations of the glass as it receives the flow of sand, the sounds of flowing sand that mark and symbolize time spent waiting on death row. That encase us from reality, that shield us from unbearable truths. Does the glass of the hour enclose time or shield us from time? Does time exist inside the glass or outside the glass? Is reality more real as sand flowing within the tubes of glass, or the waiting outside, the waiting for a meal, the waiting for a cell door to close, the waiting for a sound, the waiting for sleep, the waiting for a letter, the waiting for justice, the waiting for a trial, the waiting for truth, the waiting for someone to hear, the waiting for someone to listen, the waiting for someone to understand, the waiting for silence to be something other than silence. The curve, the arc drawn from the right side of the poem to the right side of the poem. In the first stanza alone, if the first stanza were its own hourglass, which in fact we know it not to be, would pass through the words silenced and truths, would pass through the words be silenced and unbearable truths, would pass through the phrases must be silenced and from unbearable truths, would pass through the phrases voices must be silenced and from unbearable truths, would pass through the lines some voices must be silenced, shielding us from unbearable truths. The second stanza, drawing the arc, drawing the curve in the same manner, would pass through the words deaf and silenced, would pass through the phrases to be deaf and not to be silenced, would pass through the phrases choose not to be deaf and must not be silenced, would pass through the lines, but some may choose not to be deaf, some voices must not be silenced. The first stanza of such a poem the arc drawn in the opposite manner from the left side of the page. Would pass through the words some and shielding, would pass through the phrases some voices and shielding us, would pass through the phrases some voices must be and shielding us from, would pass through the lines some voices must be silenced, shielding us from unbearable truths. The second stanza, the arc, the curve drawn in the same manner, would include the words but and some, would include the phrases but some may and some voices must, would include the lines but some may not choose, may choose not to be deaf, but some may choose not to be deaf. And the line, some voices must not be silenced. If the manner of silencing such a poem were to draw lines through it in the form of X's, and one were to begin with the first segment, drawing an X through both stanzas of the first segment defined as section 1 of a sequence for Mumia Abu-Jamal, one would draw a line through the words some, threaten, clear, the, us, choose, broken, comfort, piteous, and silenced. From the left side, inception, to the right side, conclusion of the X, and conversely from the right side to the left, one would draw that line between the words silence, structured, respectable, vibrations, crystalline, us, from, choose, with, smooth, comfort, beg, rising, some. And again, if one were to draw such silencings in the form of X's in the first segment of the poem called Sequence for Mumia Abu-Jamal, but one were to draw them separately, marking out each stanza individually, one would draw the lines as follows: some threaten safe vibrations, crystalline reality, truths, silenced structures, safe, clear, shatter, encase, shielding. And then for the second stanza, but, beat, smooth, comfort, piteous, and silenced. And finally, deaf, palms, impenetrable, comfort, to, from, some. But some voices must be silenced, but some may choose not to be deaf. But some voices must be silenced of seemingly safe, respectable lives against the smooth, impenetrable glass. But some voices must be silenced, their clear vibrations of lies and comfort and power. But some voices must be silenced and beg to hear the piteous cries. But some voices must not be silenced, they threaten the structures. But some voices must be silenced, they also threaten the structures of seemingly safe, respectable lives, the sand that flows through them, the sand that flows through the seemingly safe, shatter the crystal shelters, encase us, reality, structures, reality, forms, reality, shapes and metaphors, reality, our lives, reality, comfort and power of lies, begging to hear itself in the sand. Some voices must not be silenced, smooth, choose, beat with broken palms. Some voices must not be silenced. They threaten the structures of seemingly safe, respectable lives. Some voices must not be silenced. Their clear vibrations, their shattering of crystalline shelters that encase us, them, we, he, she, the pronouns from the realities. Some voices and their stories, some voices and their silences, some silences that bear the burden of story, some stories that bear the burden of silence, some stories that bear the burden of flowing time, metaphorized in the hourglass and the sand that falls from the function of gravity and the physics that we understand as a part of our world, a world defined as reality by physical matter, space, and time, and the way that one is defined within such time, whether it is silenced or defined by something else. The second segment of a poem, defined as sequence for Mumia Abu-Jamal, inscribed with the letter I repeated to mark the Roman numeral designation of the second section of the sequence. 2. I1, II2. Unlike the first two stanzas, if we take the second segment as stanza and as third stanza of the poem defined as sequence for Mumia Abu-Jamal, unlike the first two stanzas, the third stanza is separated from what precedes it by the Roman numeral 2. If we were to read the marker that separates stanza 2 and stanza 3 as a line, we would read, some voices must not be silenced. 2. The smooth, impenetrable glass. If we were to read the arc formed between the two stanzas, with the two bearing the weight of the apex of the arc, the apogee, we would read, silenced 2, glass. If the first segment is the segment of silencing within the glass, the second segment is the smooth, impenetrable glass itself. How to define such a glass? How to define such a 2, a glass, the smooth, impenetrable glass that separates us from the image of time. Outside, we are in time. Inside the glass that separates us from itself, we are what? In representational time. in time symbolized as the passage of sand that we cannot touch. Neither can we, in the space of waiting on death row, touch the sand that flows on the beaches that exist as realities of time and the weathering away of stone, because sand becomes sand by weathering the tide, as these stones in this image have become smooth, like the impenetrable glass, by being measured in time by the current of water, of waves, of the shore, of the rushing, the flow of time in space, and have become smooth. The rough edges, the sharp edges of the shards of stone that one might use as tools or weapons have become effaced, or one could say silenced, by the weathering of time, by the effacement of the edges, the broken, the lines, and now are experienced only as smooth, curved, comforting gatherings of hard, but safe, respectable stones. And such safe, respectable stones and their clear vibrations, their sheltering realities, shield us from the unbearable truth of their lives as former shards, broken pieces of larger stone, this one a segment of mountain, that one a segment of hill, this one a segment of above ground, that one a segment of below. The smooth, impenetrable glass of indifference and uncaring is cool, writes the poet, and the smooth surface of the stone is comforting and also cool and pleasant to the touch. One does not hesitate to pick up such a stone, whether to cast it across the surface of the water or to receive the cool, comforting flow of its coolness against the heat of the day in one's hand, or to marvel at the beauty and the grace of the curves and arcs in such stones. Stones that possess the heart of power, the healing, and seem to speak, if only in a language of their own, language that conceals something of what they once were, or of the time required to smooth them into forms one is eager to pick up and hold on their way to becoming sand that one places in an hourglass that might be utilized to mark the endless experience of time as experienced on death row. The smoothness, the coolness, the pleasantness, the gathering of such stones that conceals something, as the poet says, of the rottenness within our world. The smooth, the indifference, the cool, the pleasant, the curve, the grace, the fittedness, the scale, the human scale, the indifference, the heart, the hidden, the language of stones.